Hello, welcome to Cerulean Arts Gallery. We're here with Allison Syvertsen for our virtual tour and talk in conjunction with her Cerulean Collective Exhibition, which is on view through December 3rd. Hello, Allison.
Hi, Mike.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Good. Good to see you. So I'm gonna spotlight Tina's video here. And all right, so please tell us a little bit about yourself and the show.
Uh, well, this is a collection of work, some very recent, some from a few years back. Still lifes and landscapes. The most recent work is the still life work. Most recently, I've been working on these cake paintings. I like working with the cakes because they're actually remarkably good subject matter. They're very malleable. You can cut and mold them in various ways. They're almost sculptural. And recently I've been incorporating these flower motifs into the work. Sort of to give it that sense of a like botanical quality. And I just like the decorative aspect of it. Not quite sure why I started doing the buttercream flowers in particular. Um,
And you're working from direct observation, yes?
yes, and that's one way I like to work. That's partly from working from landscapes previously. I like to work from direct observation, whether it's sketching or actually painting on site. Working in my studio gives me the freedom to set my own, um, almost like still life landscapes. Um, This is a piece along my party themes I was doing. For me, the parties um, don't necessarily signify something really happy. I'm a very introverted, quiet person, so parties for me seem kind of stressful, with lots of noise and stuff and mess. And so, with this piece in particular, I was trying to convey a sort of chaotic feeling where the lone piece of cake looked almost stranded amidst this mess and clutter and noise. This was a particularly hard painting too. It's a little larger than I normally work. It's 18 by 18. And I kept changing the composition because I kept throwing more stuff into it to give it more of a chaotic feel. And then things kept moving around because the balloons kept popping or the confetti kept blowing, or I kept changing things on my own. And so I know with this piece in particular, it just took a very long time to resolve. There were weeks and months when I just felt like I couldn't even see my way out of it. I wasn't quite sure whether I was going to come to a successful end or whether I was just wasting my time. And sometimes you just have to stick with it for a really long time to figure out where you're going with it. So in the end, I was pretty happy with it. But it is supposed to be more of a chaotic feeling piece rather than purely a happy piece, although however people want to perceive is perfectly fine.
And you're working with gouache paint.
Yes, most of the pieces in the show are gouache. Gouache is nice because it's a water-based paint, but it's opaque, so you can layer with it, similar to how you would with oils. And I find it very forgiving, and I do like to layer quite a bit. A lot of these paintings have a lot of paint on the surface. Here's another one of the cake and flower pieces. I was doing these paired pieces that I call bouquets, where it was just cake functioning almost in place of stems and a cluster of flowers on top. This piece in particular almost has a romantic feel. You can see how cake or still life objects of any kind can kind of take on a sort of human-like quality. So these pieces um, had this feeling of kind of like nuzzling up against each other. So it almost feels like a sort of romantic piece, especially with the wallpaper backdrop I had against it,
Yes,
or behind it.
the color communicates that too, the pinks and reds. And
Yeah, it has a very rosy sort of feel to it. I was happy with how the reflection came out on the plate as well. It's one of those little things that, you try to make the whole piece come together, but sometimes there's these little parts where you just kind of put in with a few strokes and you're happy with it in a way where you're like, oh, I didn't know I could do that. So it was sort of a happy accident.
Yeah, sometimes we get lucky.
Which is perfectly valid for anyone else making art. Yeah, so this wall is some of the more recent work, again, along the cake themes. Um, and moving ahead, this is a collection. They're all fairly recent pieces, again, just focusing on the in-studio still lifes. The piece in the middle is the most recent. The ones on the end came about within the last just couple years. Some of them, like the one on the end, just playing with repetition and pattern, um, just kind of the nature of like keeping items and having this play between like the dots of the sprinkles and the dots on the plate and the dots on the background, just trying to kind of um, have this layered quality or having this feeling of, you know, having some difficulty in distinguishing between the foreground and the background in some areas. Um,
And are you making this baking? Or are you purchasing it?
Mostly purchasing. That one was mostly purchase pieces. You can see some of the like cheap like hostess cakes in that one.
I guess that stuff lasts.
Most of these are the grocery store cakes. The flowers I decorate on the cakes. This is another one of the party theme pieces, again, where you can see where it's, you know, very festive colors. This was a companion piece to another piece. The other piece was an upright cake called Big Celebration. It was about like celebrating a joyous moment, feeling confident and striding forward into your future. This is the feeling where sometimes you feel let down when the future wasn't quite what you pictured.
Well, it's called Pity Party.
Pity party. Like it's the party theme.
Not
The colors in this always strike me as Crayola colors. And then later I looked at the construction paper pack I looked at, or that I was making the shapes out of, and it was Crayola brand. So I guess that was fitting.
mhm. So would you say these have a metaphorical quality?
Some of them, I was always wishing I was the kind of artist who could make paintings that really were about my life, like really autobiographical paintings. You know, not necessarily like lacking a sense of abstraction, but paintings that felt more attached to who I was as an artist. And some of these have a feeling of a sort of standing quality for just different states of mind or what's happening. But some of these pieces also just, you know, might have a more decorative sense or a more landscapey feel. This piece in particular, mostly because of its size, it's larger than I normally work. Even though it's still life subject matter, it has very much the feeling of a broader landscape to me. Um, and again, playing with this theme of the confectionery flowers. I'm not quite sure what they mean yet. It feels like they are significant in some way. I didn't want real flowers, and I tried using fake flowers that were cloth flowers, and they didn't have quite the right feeling to me either. There's something about the buttercream flowers that I make, whether it's because they're more sculptural or because I have more control over them, or whether it's something about their artificiality. I don't know. It's one of the subjects where I feel like maybe there's more to it. I just have to sit with it for a while, or maybe I just like them because I think they're pretty. Um, Sometimes it takes a while for you to realize like even what your own work is about. So that might be the case with this.
What prompted you to make a larger scale piece this time?
I had been wanting to work larger. I kept feeling that tug. I started out quite small with my earliest cake paintings, very much like a single cupcake on a 6x6 or 8x8 sheet of paper. And there's something about working large where it it brings a different quality to your working when the work feels your field of vision as you're working, where you're kind of surrounded by your work. I had trouble working large because initially I thought to translate to the size, I would do my same subject matter, but larger, and it never looked right. I always had this sort of artificial inflated quality, like it was a Macy's Day float or something, just like a really big puffy cupcake or a really big cake. And really, I had more success working large when it was just a larger area to put more stuff into rather than make any one object much larger. And that for me was a more comfortable fit. And it gave me a lot more room to maneuver, to play with the composition or with themes or to, um, really construct the space in a different way.
And so you work in a layered approach with gouache.
Yeah, I do tend to work in layers. Especially on larger pieces like this, because you have to move around quite a bit. It does allow you the freedom to feel like you don't need to over fuss some areas. Like some areas are a little looser. So there's a few areas in here where I just put down one layer of paint and just let it be. Like I liked how it looked. But most areas, there's at least like an initial sketchy layer, and then I go through and refine it. And a lot of times with the refining, I'm changing compositional details, moving things around or adding things in. Um, there are some late additions to this composition where I do sketch out my paintings ahead of time and try to plan for them as much as I can in advance. But sometimes when you're actually pulling it together, especially if there's a lot of things going on, you see holes in the composition or you see these areas where some of the objects are creating this directional movement. It's kind of pulling you out of the piece or like leading you away from some central focus. So sometimes you have to fill in areas or nudge things over or change the direction of things. So that lends itself to some additional layering as well. But I do like layering with gouache where it almost has a sort of tactile feel to it.
So the one on the left is called Not the Fun Kind.
Yeah, that was most of the cakes I paint are pretty appealing. This is one kind of cake that I would never buy on my own to use. I forget what they call it, like a
Looks pretty terrifying.
unicorn cake. I can't remember. It's pretty gross. It's like layers of cookie dough, but it was like really oily cookie dough where you knew it just wasn't made with butter. It was made with various oils and
Mhm.
artificial ingredients. And the whole thing, like I tried to stand it upright, and my compositional drawings of it upright were really interesting. I had a very architectural feel with all these layers, but it just wouldn't stand because under the studio lights, it just kept falling over and melting and sagging. It was just smearing all over the plate. And it was one of those things where you finally realize that you kind of need to go with the subject as it is rather than what you're trying to go with, like what your preconceived idea was. And so in that way, I kind of liked it.
So the smear in the bottom right, did you smear your brush or did you paint the smear?
Um, it was kind of a smearing motion with the brush, but then the nice thing about working with gouache is you can refine some of the edges. So it's not just purely like trying to create like a happy accident, like a single brush stroke. Some of it you can kind of get that arm movement in and then refine it a little bit so it has the feeling that you want it to in the final piece.
So you've worked in oil too in the past, and are you going back and forth between oil and gouache, or do you not
I
prefer
try
gouache?
to, and I don't think oil is, out of my future necessarily. I was always more comfortable with oil. And then when I switched to gouache, I just got used to the feeling of it. And when I tried to transition back to oil just felt very goopy and very heavy, and I was having trouble with some of the vapors from that. This is again one of the confections. This is an example of not all parties are bad. Like the parties with like lots of stuff in it, I think of as being stressful, but this is one of my birthday pieces, and birthdays aren't bad. The idea of being acknowledged by people you care about or acknowledging other people on their birthdays when you care about them. And this was a birthday gift from a friend who sent me a box of biscotti. And I like the sort of organic feeling, like organic drizzles on the forms there, coupled with the green sort of landscapey feel of the plate and the landscape element of these artificial rainbows behind it. Um, it's not the flashiest piece, but I've always quite liked this piece. It's just kind of a happy, simple, straightforward piece that just came across very well. But yes, what I was saying before, the oil, you certainly can go back and forth with it quite easily, just because a lot of the application techniques are similar. But I just fell in love with gouache just because of um, there's a lightness to it. Like it doesn't have quite the thickness or like the goopiness that oil can have, and I can still achieve some of the same brush strokes with it. And again, it was easier to use in like my very small studio. There's really no concerns about breathing in fumes from terpenoids or various mediums. Here again is another one of the cake pieces. This was actually the cake that's in the larger piece in the background. I bought this, inexpensive store cake like I usually do with the idea of decorating the surface. And I figured I like the cake so much, the sort of domed feeling of all these flowers, like a little garden. I wanted to get a little bit more mileage out of this object, so I decided to do it as a single one-off painting. This one's called Night Flowers, which is sort of an accidental title. I didn't have a title in mind for this one, but I had a blue backdrop. And initially, when I laid in the color sort of loosely behind it, the white of the paper was coming through in certain areas and it almost had a starlight quality. But the background really wasn't finished. I did another layer and I lost those little white flecks, and I realized I kind of missed them. So I added little touches of them in. So it's not literally a night sky, it's just sort of suggestive of it. Technically, it's sort of the reverse of a night sky because it's normally the sky would be lighter at the bottom and get darker toward the top. So this is sort of reverse of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, it's sort of an ambiguous space. It's not really clear where it is, and it's not a literal sky, and there's no reason why the cake would be outside at night anyway. But it was just one of those feelings where it just felt like a nighttime piece, and it was nice to highlight that.
It gives it a somewhat monumental quality.
Well, the cake itself had a monumental quality. I heaped it quite high because I was trying to really build it up to go into the other piece.
So flanking this piece are two of your playground paintings.
Yes, these are a few years old. This was more when I was doing exclusively landscape work, but I started doing these playgrounds, and they are somewhat fitting for this show because I always thought of the playgrounds as being kind of still life objects, which is interesting with the other work because like especially with the larger cake piece that felt more like a landscape. So you do get this sort of mixing of genres. And a lot of the colors are kind of the same. These are the actual colors of this playground equipment. I think they've been painted since then, but you could see that's what initially drew me to it. This one is in its own sort of ambiguous space because I didn't feel the need to put in the whole background because I really wanted to highlight um, this playground setup as its own weird form by itself. The landscape work it's fun to do when it's going well. I switched to working mostly indoors because, for practical reasons, especially if you're an artist working full time, it is hard to maintain a steady practice to get outside and to expect um, consistent weather conditions and other factors for you when you have such limited time and when you're normally working during daytime hours. um, and a lot of these pieces I actually worked mostly from sketches where I'd go outside and make very detailed sketches and color notes, kind of like what Hopper used to do, like noting the color mixture so I could remember it. And I might shoot a few photos, but I was mostly reliant on my own notes. Um, and then I was able to reconstruct it indoors. So that was a way of me sort of bringing some of my outdoor practice indoors where I could be a little bit more thoughtful and take my time a bit more to get the composition right or to mix the colors or to get that sense of finish that I wanted.
And when you draw on like a graph paper, like a gridded paper.
Usually for the landscape work, the graph paper is very forgiving because especially if you're working in an urban environment, um, it helps you gauge space a little bit better and to um, place architectural structures when you have these straight vertical and horizontal lines to gauge against. Um, it also helps with the transfer process because oftentimes I'll grid that composition to then transfer onto another surface. I might enlarge it or make it smaller.
Which is
For
a traditional drawing technique.
I'm sorry.
It's a traditional drawing technique, yes?
Yes, it's again, it's a very forgiving way of working. It allows you the freedom to be able to change things from an initial sketch, but still retain what you liked about the initial sketch. And it's a very straightforward process. You don't need special equipment to make your transfers that way. For the still lifes, I'm usually working because I'm on site and I usually don't need to transfer a smaller sketch to another size piece of paper. I'm usually working more directly. Oftentimes I'm making little thumbnail sketches in a sketchbook to play with different ways of presenting the composition.
And that's a silver point drawing. Yes, that
Yes,
is.
I think aside from the gouache, it's just silver point drawings in here, which is another traditional technique. Instead of drawing with graphite, to draw with a piece of metal, oftentimes silver, fitted into a stylus. And it has to be on a prepared sheet of paper in order to pick up the transfer of the metal onto the surface. I like silver point because it does tarnish over time, so the drawings can darken and become a little bit warmer over time, especially with exposure to sunlight. So it makes them more of a like almost a living thing that changes over time.
How do you prepare the paper?
These papers, there's more traditional ways of preparing papers. I prepare with a layer of gouache because obviously I already have it. The nice thing about that too is it does give you that like slightly chalky surface, so it makes it a very receptive material for the silver point, but you can also tint it a little bit. So you're not working on this bright white of the paper, you're working on these softer um, grays or pink or green tones that just give it a little bit of extra nuance to the drawing, I think, to highlight it in different ways or to soften it or to interact with the color of the silver point. This is one of the earlier cake paintings. And this was more of the size I traditionally used to work, so you can see how different it was working with a much larger cake painting on the other wall.
This is called Dark Heart.
Yeah, it's kind of a accidental title. One of the little loops of frosting always looked like a little heart to me. Um, and this was like a little chocolate cake painting, but I didn't really want to paint it in shades of brown, so I had a like filters over my light to cast like a reddish glow over it. So it gave it that reddish quality that was fitting for like a traditional sort of heart motif.
So this weekend, you're teaching a gouache painting workshop, a 2-day workshop here at the gallery in conjunction with this show. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The gouache workshops I've done from time to time. It's a nice format to work with to learn gouache because gouache is actually a very accessible medium to get into, whether you're coming in fresh and have no painting experience. There's very few materials to maneuver, and it's very direct, but it also lends itself to like various prior painting experience. So you can be a watercolorist and come into gouache, and it'll feel very similar as a water-based paint, but you can layer with it differently and play with that sense of opacity, or even incorporate gouache into your watercolor work to, use it within your current practice. If you're an oil or acrylic painter, it'll feel familiar just in terms, again, of that opacity where you can layer with it in a very similar way, even though it's a water-based paint. So it really only takes learning, like, a few tips on, using the materials, or how to select the materials to purchase, how to get used to the feeling of applying it to a surface, and to explore color mixing with it or layering with it. So the 2-day workshop is really the perfect format to pick up the basics. And then from there, you can take it in any direction you want. Again, whether you want to take it more into a watercolor direction, use it more loosely, more diluted with water, or if you want to apply it more the way I do with, a heavily layered effect to achieve a more oil or acrylic-like surface. So it just really is intended to get you started with the materials.
That's a nice alternative to oil, as you mentioned, since it doesn't have the same issues with solvents, etc.
Yeah, it's just the paint, and you just mix it with water usually. Um,
And it's very portable.
yeah, they're small tubes of paint. Oftentimes you'll see people working on smaller surfaces with gouache, not necessarily, but it lends itself to, smaller brush strokes. It doesn't usually people aren't looking to spread it and like really thin it out over a broad surface. So it's very good for sketching, like if you're traveling or if you're working in a small area. You can work on a tabletop, either flat or slightly propped up, right? So you really don't need a traditional studio setup with your own easel. So you can work just as easily on a kitchen table or just in a small workspace.
And still life will be the subject for the workshop.
Yes, we'll be working on still life. Still life is a good way to start because it brings into play different ideas of color mixing, because you can explore different color combinations very easily in still life, and also aspects of composition and the way you assemble the still life or crop it or pick different views from it. So it's a good way to start no matter what your interest is in subject matter.
And the workshop takes place this Saturday and Sunday, November 18th and 19th. And if you still have some space, and if people want to sign up, they can go to the ceruleanarts.com website to do that. And you're also supplying the paint and some paper, correct?
Yeah, there's a small materials list so people can bring some of their own stuff. And some people who have some prior, especially watercolor experience, might already have these items. But we'll be supplying the paint and some surfaces. So that way you can get to try out the materials before making the investment into actually purchasing them. So you can see if you really enjoy them first, or learn about different brands, or what your preferences might be in terms of paper, before you actually purchase these things for your own practice.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Allison.
Sure, thank you.
And thank you for the show. It's really beautiful.
Thanks. Well, I hope everyone enjoys it.
And actually, in the workshop, you will tour the students through the show.
Yeah, it's a nice idea to have the work right there. Sometimes you can be able to point things out in your past work when you're able to get up close to it, so you can, point out different brush strokes or different techniques by seeing the work in person.
Well, looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again and have a great night.
Thank you. You too.